The Steelers have just upset the Cincinnati Bengals, and this is going to shake up the entire AFC playoff picture from here. And this is a much needed win for the Pittsburgh Steelers as they're trying to get back into the playoff position after losing three straight. And this is both a significant win to keep the Steelers' playoff hopes alive, as well as a crushing blow to the Bengals. Um, both teams are 8-7 right now, but there's a reason why the Steelers actually have an edge over the Cincinnati Bengals going forwards. So, the Pittsburgh Steelers won 34-11. Usually, when you have this kind of an upset, it's a narrow margin of victory. In this case, the Steelers kicked ass. It could have been a scoregami, turned out not to be. Because the Steelers just had to get that field goal, but it still was a rare score and also a humiliating loss by Cincinnati. Looking at Cincinnati as a team, they have not exactly been playing good. They lost their first two games to the Browns and the Ravens, beat the Rams, but then they got squished by the Titans. They beat the Cardinals, Seahawks, 49ers, Bills to get them to long link to get them to a 5-3 record. But then the Bengals would begin to go on a bit of a tear from there, losing to the Texans, the Ravens, and the Steelers. So the Steelers will actually have sweep advantage over the Bengals. They did beat the Jaguars, the Colts, and the Vikings. Two of those games went to overtime, and now they lost to the Steelers. And remember what I said, the Steelers are going to have sweep advantage over the Bengals if it comes down to a tiebreaker, which is possible. Now, the Steelers, they started off by losing to the 49ers, but then they beat the Browns, they beat the Raiders, they lost the Texans, though, but then they beat the Ravens and the Rams. They lose to the Jaguars, but then they beat the Titans and Packers. They lost to the Browns, but then they beat the Bengals, but then they lost to the Cardinals, Patriots, and Colts. So the Steelers had built themselves up to a 7-4 record because this is after their loss, and I clicked on the wrong game, but they were 7-4 before losing to the Cardinals, and they lost to two of the worst teams in the NFL, the Cardinals and the Patriots. Both of those teams have been eliminated from the playoffs and have some of the worst records in their divisions. As a matter of fact, both teams right now are currently 3-11, and they were 2-10 when they took on the Steelers. So again, really embarrassing losses by the Steelers in those cases. But that win is significant. First of all, notice how, again, the Steelers are ahead of the Bengals because they have sweep advantage. Now I want to look at the playoff picture for the AFC. Now for the AFC, neither the Steelers nor the Bengals are in playoff position. But Pittsburgh beat Cincinnati based on head-to-head sweep. Whether or not they can get into the playoff picture for the week is going to depend on how some of these other games go. I personally find it unlikely just because the Colts, Texans, and Bills are all 8-6 right now. And for some reason, all of them losing is unlikely, and they would need, two of these teams to lose. When you look at it from an 8-7 standpoint, the Broncos have a better conference record than the Bengals and a worse conference record than the Steelers. But because the Steelers would already beat the Bengals based on that head-to-head tiebreaker anyway, and the Broncos just fit, they would fit in between if they win this week. I think that therefore we can conclude that it would go Steelers, Broncos, Bengals. Should the Broncos win this weekend, so they lose, they're 7-8, and then they gotta deal with the fact that if the Raiders upset the Chiefs, and if the Broncos lose, their season's pretty much over at that point. honestly, being 8-7 at week 15 is not really going to get you into playoff position in this kind of an AFC. You really got to be 9-6 at week 15 if you want to be taken seriously for the playoffs. But there are some things that we have to keep in mind. First of all, should the Jaguars lose and the Colts or the Texans win, depending on tiebreakers, it could very well be that the Jaguars lose their control of the AFC South. As of now, they have they based on head-to-head record, they would beat ties based on Indianapolis and Houston. Specifically, that Indianapolis will beat the Bills based on conference record. And division tie was used to break tie over Houston because of head-to-head victory. But the Texans will break the tie over the Bills based on, again, conference record. So the Bills lose out on both of them. And that's why they're not in a playoff position. But all the Bills really got to do is win this week. And if they can win this week, they can really just come back in there and just really put themselves in a good position. But it relies on the Colts and the Texans losing, which I, for some reason, find both of those scenarios to be unlikely. But again, if one of them wins and the Jaguars lose, it would put the Jaguars into this 8-7 position in the wild card mess. And how they would fare from there, I just honestly don't know, because it begins to become a bit of a minefield with all these scenarios. Pretty much, it's very unclear, but I would say it's unlikely at this point that the Steelers can get into the playoff position with only being 8-7. It would involve a lot of teams having to lose, but remember, the Colts and Texans clinching the division will take care of one of the teams, but then you have to bring the Jaguars back into playoff picture. If they were 8-7, if the Jaguars improve to 9-6, then the Colts and Texans are still stuck below them, but then at that point, they're obviously not going to be if from that point on they win. So there's that. So I'd say that both teams' playoff probabilities are unlikely, but the Bengals really had their playoff hopes taken a beating down, whereas this does inject some life back into Pittsburgh. And if Pittsburgh and Cincinnati have the same record, Pittsburgh will break the tie with Cincinnati because of the head-to-head sweep. Actually, based on conference record, I already knew that the Bengals were going to lose a tiebreaker to the Steelers, but this really just goes deeper than that. Like the Cincinnati Bengals lost all 5 of their divisional games this year, all 5. So they would lose any tiebreaker in the division, and it would also significantly harm their conference record should it come down to any of that. Now, looking at the Steelers, I initially predicted the Steelers were going to lose out. I still think that they're going to lose to the Baltimore Ravens at home, but even in Seattle, I think that they could beat the Seahawks now. And yes, we obviously know that the Seahawks managed to beat Philadelphia, which is why I put some life back into them. And they're probably going to beat the Titans. But I just don't think that they could beat this now resurgent Steelers team. They beat a strong Bengals team, and I don't think that. And I think that the Seahawks might actually struggle against that. This is going to have implications on both the AFC and NFC playoff race. Now, my prediction of the Steelers finishing 9-8, again, this kind of an AFC, really not going to be significant enough. But it'll also drop the Seahawks down to 9-8, and with them losing a tie over the Rams, who I still think are going to finish 9-8, that would keep them out of the postseason picture. Again, with my current predictions, I think also the Vikings finishing 9-8. But the Vikings have a better conference record. Remember, ties are broken in conference first, so when you just look at the records, the Seahawks finished 7-5 first of all. Vikings I have finishing 8-4 on their conference record. Rams I have finishing 7-5. But remember, they have the sweep advantage, and the Vikings would just beat both those teams and keep the Seahawks out of the postseason. So again, it would be a pretty crushing blow to the Seahawks postseason hopes if they lose to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I now predict the Steelers will beat the Seahawks for Week 17. But then the Steelers' playoff hopes are then dashed by losing to the Ravens. The only way I could see the Ravens not being the Steelers is they're resting their starters because they clinched the 1 seed, but they might not even do that because they'll have a week to relax. And if it involves Pittsburgh being kicked out of the postseason, they might not just let them in like that. Again, I don't know what they're going to do. If they already clinched, they might not care at that point. But and that's really the only way I could see the Steelers beating the Ravens and thus even being taken seriously for a playoff position. But the Bengals, who I initially thought was going to make the playoffs, again, them against the Chiefs and against the Browns, I kind of see them losing both games and finishing 8-9 now. Again, like they were going on this really nice run, but I just don't see that anymore. I just don't. So so again, it's gonna have no matter what happens, all these games are going to like have implications on the playoff picture. But again, it's a pretty big blow, and the Bills are being the Chargers. In case you were wondering, like let's just look up the Bengals playoff odds, and their playoff odds were only 39% to begin with after losing to the Steelers. So now you have to consider that game to be taken out because they didn't update it. And it drops their playoff chances to 15%. Um, their playoff chances really took a big hit with their loss to the Steelers when they were an unlikely team anyway. I guess it's because of the probability of them beating the Chiefs and whatnot. Now, the Steelers, after they lost to the Colts, they only had a 5% chance to make the playoffs. Their playoff chances are still at only 11%, and that's again because they would have to beat the Ravens in Week 18 and beat the Seahawks. But I mean, like, if the Steelers lost, they would have been out of it completely, pretty much. So so you just got to look at the Steelers and just think how like again, like I don't want to say their playoff odds are that bad because they're not like too bad, but I mean like but the Bengals honestly have a better chance of making the playoffs than the Steelers. Like I don't think either team is making it this year. Now the Bills are beating the Chargers 14-10. The Chargers' chances of making the postseason as of now with a 5-9 record are less than 1 in 100,000. Um, it really is a foregone conclusion, and if the Bills can hold out in the victory, then then the then the Chargers will be eliminated. Honestly, Chargers went out, and their playoff chances are still less than 1%. They would need like so much stuff to go right for them. It's practically zero. Um, Whereas you look at the Bills, and they might not be in it exactly, but after the Bills beat the Cowboys, their playoff chances are now 63%. And if the Bills can beat the Chargers, it wouldn't go up. The playoff hope odds wouldn't go up that much, but they would go up to 74%. So again, this is a very important game for the Bills. Whereas for the Chargers, it's pretty much do they die or they like prolong the suffering. But I see the Bills winning.